Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. Today, Dr. Paul Carisse is going to talk with us about some clauses in the First Amendment, specifically the freedom of religion, the freedom of exercise, kind of giving us a broad overview. And then we're going to go deeply into the establishment of religion as well as the free exercise in subsequent podcast episodes. So, Dr. Carisse, what is the freedom of religion and how do the establishment clause and the free exercise clause work? Because they seem to be in contradiction to each other.
Well, thank you, Liz. Another very important question. And as usual, I'm going to ask us to start with the text of the First Amendment. So if you would read at least the first few clauses in the First Amendment, and then I'll try and talk about what we learn about freedom of religion.
Okay. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or of the right of the people to peaceably assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances.
Okay, great. And for our topic, just notice that the two clauses about religion are first, before we get to obviously very important topics of freedom of speech and freedom of press. So let's start there. Why would freedom of religion be the first two topics for liberty protected in the Bill of Rights in the First Amendment? Well, one important thing to notice is that freedom of religion was already protected in the 1787 Constitution before amendment in Article 6. So better have your pocket constitutions out, folks. So at the end of Article 6, it talks about the third clause of Article 6 talks about the fact that all people who hold offices under the federal government and in the state legislatures and all judges, federal and state, will have to be bound by oath or affirmation to support this Constitution. And we might think that really doesn't have anything to do with religious liberty, but the choice of the phrase oath or affirmation, capital O oath, capital A affirmation, is a religious liberty issue. Among the Protestant community in America at the time of the founding, there were those who thought that an oath was a kind of idol worship. If you were taking an oath to a government or to a law, that was violating your first duty to believe in God. It was like worshiping a false god, right? So oath or affirmation, allowing affirmation, is a religious liberty principle. Then there's an explicit religious liberty principle that follows that closes out Article 6 of the Constitution, and we don't notice it as a religious liberty issue. So the end, and no, so anyone who serves in any offices, federal or state, has to take an oath or affirmation to support the Constitution. But, says the final clause, but no religious test, capital T, shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. There you go, religious liberty. But also notice it's a matter of public record at the time that the Constitution is proposed in 1787, ratified in 1788, that there are established religions in the states. And the Constitution's got nothing to do with that. If a state has an established religion or it doesn't, that's their business in the states. But for the federal government to hold federal office, no religious test, meaning you can believe anything or nothing about religion. It has nothing to do with whether you're qualified to hold office. Okay, so that's a religious liberty principle. Now, that suggests to me between the two Article 6 clauses and the first two clauses of the First Amendment being about religion, that suggests to me freedom of religion is the single most important liberty or right in the American mind
Hmm.
for the framers and the ratifiers. Now, someone might say, wait a minute, Professor Carice, you went back into the 1787 Constitution. Aren't there rights protected in earlier in the Constitution? Fair point. So back in Article 1, in Section 9, it is true there's a kind of mini Bill of Rights. This is one of the arguments that the Anti-Federalists made against ratifying the Constitution. Hey, wait a minute. Don't give us this phony baloney, Hamilton and Federalist number 84 or others. We don't need a Bill of Rights because there are just very few enumerated federal powers, and we don't need to get into a list of all the things the government can't do because federal government can't do very much. Okay, that's the argument. Well, wait a minute. In Article 1, Section 9, say the Anti-Federalists, you've got in the second clause, the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended, right? Except in case of rebellion or invasion. Then no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. Okay. Those are classic common law rights from the English common law. They're in the state constitutions, and there they are. Okay.
Hmm.
But those are general, my response would be those are general liberty protections about criminal law, protection against arbitrary criminal arrest or punishment by the federal government. Okay.
Hmm.
Fine. That's important for the framers in terms of political civil liberty generally. But in terms of a specific liberty, a particular topic of political controversy, I still think it's important that when framers are thinking about rights to liberty and the pursuit of happiness per the Declaration of Independence, they're thinking religious liberty. That's number one. That's why it's in Article 6 twice, and then the first two clauses of the First Amendment. So I think you phrased the question the right way. The two religion clauses in the First Amendment, and if you go back to Article 6, really two other religious clauses there, they are protecting religious liberty. And so then I think the next question to ask, would it make sense to the drafters and then the ratifiers out in the state conventions of the Constitution and the First Amendment that there's some necessary conflict between, let's just take what I'll call the two negative clauses, no religious test and non-establishment. Federal government can't require religious tests. Federal government can't establish religion. And the positive protection of free exercise of religion. Does it make sense if it was so important that they would just have made an oversight? Oh, gee,
Hmm.
we forgot. We were sloppy. I don't buy it. I think they would have thought very carefully in the drafting and then in the ratification debates, they would have discussed this. They don't see a necessary tension between the two religion clauses in the First Amendment, let alone the no religious test clause in Article 6. So that needs a little more explanation. Tensions between them, okay. That's true of that's true of the entire Constitution, different clauses in the Constitution. For goodness sakes, we have Article 1 and Article 2 and Article 3, right? It's a principle of the American mind that there's more than one principle that's important in terms of rights and liberty and Republican government. We got to figure out how to have the right balance between them. There might be tensions between them, but there's not a necessary contradiction between them. And of course, different branches of government. So yes, there might be tensions between a non-establishment of religion for the federal government alone, right? That's the First Amendment as proposed and ratified only restricts the federal government initially. Is there some necessary tension between non-establishment of religion and free exercise of religion? That I don't see a necessary tension. There might be some tough calls in particular cases, but I think the burden of argument falls on anybody who says, "Oh, there's a real problem here," contradiction. And again, notice two negative protections: no religious test, no federal establishment of religion, and a positive one: freedom to exercise your religious beliefs, freedom of worship, freedom and practice. So I'll close this first very long answer by suggesting I think really we could say all three or four of these clauses are positive about religion. Religious belief is set up here as a good element of American political life, preventing the federal government from taking any action to restrict religious beliefs or practices, to require any particular religious beliefs, to ensure freedom of religious belief and practice. All that is a good, positive thing.
So, why did the founders then believe that religion is essential, right, to sustaining a free republic and maybe even beneficial? But it also maintains that the federal government can't impose or endorse a specific religious beliefs. Isn't that in itself contradictory?
Uh, Fair question. I mean, the general answer is that the federal government restricts itself to the enumerated powers agreed to in bargaining in the Federal Convention of 1787. These are the necessary national and international powers needed, and everything else, not enumerated, not delegated up to the new federal government, is left to the police powers of the states, the plenary powers in the states for health, safety, welfare, morals. That's religion, one of them, right? So
Mhm.
uh, the main area about religion has to be left to the states, but there is going to be this statement, both negative and positive protections for liberty because it's important. And then a second answer is, why is it important? Well, I'm going to mention some phrases in the Declaration of Independence, but the paradox of religion for the late 18th century American mind is that religion has been such a source of controversy, of war, of killing, of political persecution. We're going to have this principle that it's important, but it has to be carefully managed, anything in relation to government or politics. I'm going to make the argument there's not an absolute negative stance toward religion in connection to government or politics. Thomas Jefferson's view is to call this the separation of church and state. I don't think that's
Mhm.
the predominant view among the framers. But this is a paradox. It's so important, but can be so contentious that we're going to be quite careful, complicated in how we say it's a good thing, but the federal government's not going to take strong directive action about religious beliefs. Okay. So again, why important? Well, think back to the Declaration. There are four references to a divinity in the Declaration. First is the laws of nature and nature's God, the source of these ideas of rights and justice that follow in the document and other grounds for separation from Britain. A creator endows us with
Mhm.
these unalienable rights, but also in the final paragraph, two appeals to invocations of an active providential divinity, protecting justice and liberty. So there we are at the beginning of the founding, so to speak, 1776, references to divinity, to at least the topic of religion, religious belief, very broadly couched. Then I'll go to the close of the founding as I would consider it, 1796, George Washington's farewell address. I think that's really the successful conclusion of the American founding when Washington can step down, the government is built, but also this important set of constitutional lessons that Washington offers. So after saying he's not going to run for office, be a candidate to stand for office as president, he's basically retiring from public life a second time. And lessons he wants to give about supporting the Constitution and the Union and beware of parties and factions and things. There's a clause still fairly widely cited, 200 years later, and it goes as following. Another one of his counsels and lessons. Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. I'm just going to read on two further points. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, right? Religion and morality, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. And I'll just skip the phrase, right? Where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation should desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? He's got other phrases, but note that, right? It's sort of a religion is a great pillar of human happiness on the high end, but on the kind of low end, Washington is speaking for a widely held view that to have the rule of law and to really make oaths worth something, we need a sense of religious duty and religious belief and to support ideas of religious conscience. So those are just a couple of indications from 1776, from 1796 of how important religion is. A couple of other, oh, I guess I'll just mention one more. George Washington, when he's inaugurated in 1789, adds to the presidential oath of office the phrase, after he's completed the part in Article 2 that's in quotation marks, right? The
Hmm.
official executive oath, he adds, so help me God. And he takes the whole oath holding his hand on a Bible. That was a standard practice in state governments, courts of law, things like that. He adds that. Nobody questions it. Every president, I believe, except one, for 230 some odd years, has done that, right? Bible, so help me God. And by the way, after that, he gives his first inaugural address, and then the House and the Senate and the president and the vice president, they go to a religious church service in New York. Okay? So this is just sense of how important religion was in the fabric of the American founding, and yet religious liberty was indispensable. I'm gonna make one more quotation here about Washington, right? The indispensable man, the most
Hmm.
important founder, in my view. Just one last point about religion's important, but religious liberty. So one of the extraordinary things about Washington's presidency is that he writes letters to religious congregations who have written to him to congratulate him on being elected as first president of the United States under the new Constitution. He writes letters to religious minorities in particular, Baptists, Roman Catholics, Jews. He writes letters to two Jewish congregations. Okay. So this is everything he does is a matter of public record, right? Immediately, and he knows later in history. So this is just a phrase from the letter to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, 1790. Okay. Just this one phrase. The citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy worthy of imitation, that all possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. Next paragraph. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights, religious toleration, right? Okay. For happily, Washington writes, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, about religion, right? Our government requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens in giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Boom. Right? This is before the First Amendment is proposed. Just saying religious liberty is a fundamental principle for me as president of the United States, and he knows a bit about predominant American views
Hmm.
at the time. So religion's important, but religious liberty in the American mind is crucial. The government is not going to compel, the federal government is not going to compel any particular religious beliefs.
That's crazy. You brought up Thomas Jefferson. Are you pointing to his letter from the Danbury Baptist where he talks about the separation of church and state?
Yes, I am. Right.
Okay,
And
just wanted
and
to double
yes,
check.
and yeah. So
So
you go ahead.
I was I was going to ask the last question, but if you have something to add,
No,
please
no,
do.
go ahead. Go ahead. Yep.
So you're suggesting then that these clauses in the Constitution and the First Amendment about religious liberty are really summarized as the philosophy of freedom for religious belief as opposed to freedom from religion, correct?
Yes, yes. And
Okay.
that's why the reference to Jefferson and his
Hmm.
phrase from the Danbury Baptist letter, 1803, when he's president, of separation of church and state, which takes a mostly negative view, freedom from religion. That's what the
Yeah.
religion clauses in Article 6 and the First Amendment stand for. So I'll invoke here not only what I've just mentioned from Washington, but 40 years later, the outside expert view of Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America,
Hmm.
who says, yes, on the one hand, the Americans have, and the state governments, now most of them by 18th, I think 1833 is the last disestablishment of a state religion. Tocqueville says, the Americans have this principle of separation of church and state. Okay. no government's going to require religious beliefs, state or
Mhm.
federal, by the time Washington is writing, by the time Tocqueville is writing. But, he says, the Americans do not separate religion and politics. He says this in multiple ways in Democracy in America, and it's a very good thing. He says religious belief is the first political institution of the American Democratic Republic. They rely on it to undergird ideas of civic duty and civic virtue and self-government and the entire American political culture. So I think that affirms the Washingtonian view is still predominant 40 years later when Tocqueville's writing in the 1830s. And there's just an enormous amount of evidence of this from the founding period. I could talk about the Thanksgiving proclamations that presidents still issue 230 some years later, but George Washington was the first. Why? Because Congress requested a proclamation about a day of Thanksgiving, fasting, and prayer in 1789. That Thanksgiving is a national holiday. That doesn't happen until Lincoln's presidency, but still, it's a practice that begins as a national presidential proclamation back in 1789. Christmas becomes a federal holiday. So, this paradox, yes, this sort of tension, this complexity in American politics, that religion is important, but religious liberty also is
Mhm.
important, and the government is not going to directly require any particular religious views. So I'll finish by saying, this gets quite complicated as American history goes on, partly because we become more pluralistic about religious beliefs and people from different cultures and civilizations coming here over 240 years, but also because of the 14th Amendment. So I'm sure Sean Beinberg will talk about this in the two episodes you've got scheduled on, first the non-establishment clause, then the free exercise clause, right? Once the 14th Amendment is ratified, it's interpreted as pulling the protections of the Bill of Rights up under the 14th Amendment and applying them against the state governments. And so federal courts are now arenas where people in the states can say, hey, my state government has got a law or a practice or something that violates non-establishment or violates free exercise. So it gets more complicated because the states, again, are the arena of the plenary police powers, health, safety, welfare, morals. And that means they're also in charge of schooling. So we get to these
Mhm.
questions about presence of religion in schools and all kinds of other questions and tests and court cases that are arising. But I don't think in all of that we should lose the founding orientation, the founding principle that religion is seen positively and religious liberty, religious freedom is to be protected. But it is a complicated question and a sort of complicated set of principles to be held together.
And our next episode is going to be with Dr. Beinberg on the free exercise clause. And then the one after that will be on the establishment clause. And I think that Dr. Carice just volunteered himself for our Thanksgiving episode too, because we are going to talk about presidential proclamation. So it's fun as you bring these things. I'm like, oh, we're going to have a podcast on this and this. And so, Dr. Carice, thank you so much for giving us a foundation for religious liberty and what the Constitution says. And we're going to dig in more in upcoming episodes. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Liz.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.